When two officers arrested her that sunny afternoon in Fort Collins, Colorado, they had no inkling that they would one day be forced to confront her again. This time not as a protester or defendant, but as the very person who would sit on the bench to decide their fate. On that bright day, the park bustled with life. Children laughed and played on the grassy fields. Joggers paced steadily along the winding trail, and families gathered for picnics beneath the cool, generous shade of towering oak trees. Amid the vibrancy and the sense of peaceful community, a black woman sat serenely on a bench near a gently rippling pond. A thick, hardcover book rested open in her lap. Her name was Camille, and she was a well-respected attorney who, despite the relentless demands of her profession, had managed to carve out a rare moment of respite to lose herself in the written word. Camille was deeply absorbed in the pages of her book when the sudden, piercing screech of tires shattered the quiet atmosphere. A police cruiser had pulled up abruptly at the curb, drawing the attention of several onlookers. Out stepped two uniformed officers, their faces set in stern expressions that radiated authority. Their eyes, sharp and unyielding, immediately fixed on Camille, the only person sitting alone in that tranquil corner of the park. "Ma'am, may we speak with you for a moment?" one of the officers called out in a tone that betrayed suspicion rather than genuine concern. Startled but maintaining her composure, Camille slowly lifted her gaze from the book. With the same calm that had served her so well in countless courtroom battles, she responded, "Of course." She closed her book carefully as the second officer stepped forward. His voice was clipped and businesslike as he said, "We've got a call about some suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Camille's eyes narrowed slightly in puzzled disbelief. "Suspicious activity?" she echoed, raising an eyebrow as she held up her book, as though to emphasize that she was simply reading. Despite her quiet protest, the officer's scrutiny did not lessen. "Can we see some ID?" the first officer demanded, his tone firm and unyielding. Although her pulse quickened, Camille maintained her dignity. "I don't understand why I'm being stopped," she replied. "I live in this city. I came here to enjoy the park." The second officer's voice, laced with an undercurrent of disdain, responded, "It's routine." Though his words suggested that nothing was routine at all, the remark only served to heighten the discomfort among the small crowd that had gathered. Whispers began to circulate. Some onlookers appeared curious, while others exchanged glances of unease at the evident imbalance of power in the situation. With a quiet sigh, Camille reached into her bag and withdrew her wallet. She produced her driver's license and handed it over with a measured steadiness. The officer took it and scrutinized the document with unnecessary intensity. "Camille Johnson," he read aloud in a tone that bordered on mockery. "What's your business here, Miss Johnson?" Camille inhaled deeply, striving to hold on to her calm. "I live here, and I'm just enjoying the park," she reiterated, her voice even. The officer's lips pressed into a thin line, and after a moment he returned her ID with an ambiguous remark, "We'll see." Yet, instead of departing, they lingered. Their subsequent barrage of questions felt far removed from a routine check. They resembled an interrogation. "Do you always carry a book like that with you?" one sneered. "Are you alone here, or are you waiting for someone?" the other asked, his hand deliberately resting on his belt in a manner that was both suggestive and menacing. Camille, who had faced far more combative circumstances in the courtroom, recognized immediately that the power dynamic in play was different. There was an edge in their voices, a cold, unyielding authority that left little room for explanation. Still, she chose her words with care. "I'm not going to answer any further questions unless you tell me exactly what I'm being accused of," she said firmly. At this, the first officer's eyes flashed with irritation as he stepped forward abruptly. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. "We're just doing our job. And I know the law." Camille met his challenge with unwavering resolve. "I'm not breaking any law by sitting in a public park," she replied steadily. However, reason and fairness were evidently not on the officer's agenda. Without warning, the first officer reached out and grabbed her arm. "You're resisting," he accused, even though Camille had not made any move to resist. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, startled by his sudden aggression. The murmurs from the gathering crowd swelled in volume. A man in the audience pulled out his phone, intent on recording the unfolding drama. "Stop resisting," The officer barked even louder now, his tone taking on a theatrical quality, as though he were performing for the silent, judging witnesses. Camille's heart pounded fiercely as she felt the cold, unyielding metal of handcuffs snap around her wrists. Despite the humiliation and burning frustration that surged inside her, she strove to remain calm. The officers roughly led her toward the cruiser, deliberately ignoring the outcries and questions from onlookers. As she was ushered away, Camille turned her head and locked eyes with a young woman in the crowd who was filming the incident. In that brief, unspoken exchange, there was a silent plea, a desperate hope that the injustice would be captured, witnessed, and remembered. Even as the car door slammed shut behind her, Camille knew that this was not the end of her ordeal. Rather, it marked the beginning of a long, grueling fight. Seated in the cramped backseat of the police cruiser, her mind raced as she tried to process the surreal turn of events. For years, Camille had devoted herself to defending clients, championing justice, and navigating the intricacies of the legal system. Now, by an ironic twist of fate, she found herself on the other side, as a victim of the very system she had long upheld. The absurdity of the situation stung, and though the irony might have elicited laughter in another context, there was no humor here, only a simmering, burning anger. The ride to the station was oppressively silent, save for the crackle of the police radio. Camille stared out the window as the scenery sped past, her own reflection merging with the blur of trees and distant buildings. Her wrists throbbed painfully where the cuffs bit into her skin, a physical reminder of the indignity she was enduring. Once at the station, the ordeal worsened. The booking process was invasive and humiliating, meticulously designed to strip away every last shred of dignity. Fingerprints were taken, photographs were snapped, and soon she was led to a small, cold holding cell, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed incessantly overhead. One of the officers sneered as he shut the cell door behind her, remarking, "Enjoy your stay." Inside the bleak cell, Camille sank onto a cold metal bench. Clasping her hands tightly in her lap, she replayed the events in her mind. How had a peaceful moment in the park spiraled into such a degrading and unjust experience? The answer, bitter and painfully clear, lay in the prejudice that had fueled the officer's actions. Hours passed before anyone acknowledged her presence again. Eventually, a young officer approached the cell, clipboard in hand. "Miss Johnson, you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer," he stated flatly. "On what grounds?" Camille demanded, her voice sharper than she had intended. The officer replied curtly, "You can discuss that in court," before turning away without further explanation. Slowly, Camille exhaled, forcing herself to think strategically amid the humiliation and anger. The charges were flimsy, she knew, and yet she also recognized that the battle ahead would be arduous. Cases like hers were rarely straightforward. In time, she was released on bail. Stepping out into the cool night air, which struck her like a refreshing wave after the suffocating atmosphere inside the station, Camille spotted her friend and colleague Marissa waiting by the curb. "Camille," Marissa said as she hurried over, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "Are you okay?" Camille managed a nod, though a slight tremor betrayed her inner turmoil. "I'm fine," she replied, though the word felt hollow. As they drove away, Marissa kept glancing at her, waiting for her to speak further. Finally, breaking the silence, Camille said, "I'm not letting this slide." "Not this time," Marissa affirmed, her grip on the steering wheel tightening in silent solidarity. "What are you thinking?" Marissa pressed. "I'm tired of this happening," Camille replied. "I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to fight back, and I will." That very night, Camille sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal pads, open books, and scattered notes. With her hands trembling not from fear but from a simmering, determined resolve, she began meticulously outlining a civil rights lawsuit against the officers and the entire department. Over the following days and weeks, the community began to rally around her. The young woman's video recording of Camille's arrest, capturing the calm defiance in the face of blatant injustice, went viral, and soon people from all walks of life reached out with messages of support and their own stories of injustice. With every email, every phone call, and every supportive comment, Camille's resolve grew stronger. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, humiliated, or dismissed. Even as she prepared for the grueling courtroom battle ahead, Camille could not have foreseen the moment when justice would take an unexpected turn. The weeks following her arrest were a whirlwind of intense emotions and relentless work. Her law firm, initially hesitant and worried that her very public case might tarnish their carefully cultivated reputation, eventually found no way to dissuade her. Camille explained, calmly yet firmly, that this fight was not solely for her own sake. It was about setting a precedent. The viral video had done more than spread her story. It had ignited important conversations across the city and even beyond. The footage of Camille, calm, dignified, and defiantly composed, as the officers roughly led her away, became a powerful symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. Reporters began calling, seeking interviews and commentary, but Camille turned them all down. She was not interested in media attention. Her focus was singular and unyielding. She was building a case that would not only hold the officers accountable, but would also expose the systemic flaws that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. Yet, during the long, quiet hours of the night, when the world seemed to fall silent, the weight of the situation would creep back in. Camille found herself replaying every detail of the arrest in her mind: the dismissive tone of the officers, the cold handcuffs locking around her wrists, the murmurs of the crowd. And although those memories churned her stomach, they also fueled her determination. One evening, as Camille was deep in research, poring over case files and legal precedents on her laptop, Marissa stopped by with a takeout bag. "You've been at this for hours," Marissa said gently, setting the food on the table. "I don't have a choice," Camille replied shortly, her focus unbroken. Marissa sat across from her, studying her face with concern. "You know," she began softly, "this is bigger than just a legal battle, right? People are looking to you now." Camille finally closed her laptop, meeting her friend's earnest gaze. "I know," she said steadily. "That's why I can't afford to lose." Over the following days, Camille's preparation was nothing short of meticulous. She combed through similar cases, pulling up precedents and gathering mountains of evidence designed to dismantle the officers' flimsy claims. Trusted colleagues were enlisted to help build a legal team that shared her passion for justice. Yet, it wasn't all about courtroom strategy. Camille made it a point to engage directly with the community, attending town halls, listening to others who had experienced similar injustices, and even speaking at a local college about the critical importance of accountability. One afternoon, while walking to her car after a community meeting, a stranger approached her hesitantly. "Miss Johnson," the woman said softly, her voice cracking with emotion, "I just wanted to say thank you for standing up to them, for standing up for all of us." Camille felt her throat tighten, and though she managed only a small smile, she replied, "I'm just doing what I can." The community's support, while deeply empowering, also added to the pressure. Camille felt the weight of expectation, not just her own, but that of everyone who believed in fairness and justice. She couldn't let them down. Then, one day, Camille received a call from her attorney with startling news. The officers she was suing had filed a motion to dismiss the case. As expected, it was a standard delaying tactic. But as her attorney explained the next steps, he added something that left her momentarily speechless. "Camille," he said cautiously, "you should know something else. You've been assigned as the judge for one of their cases next month." The irony was staggering. After spending weeks preparing to fight these officers in court, fate had handed her an entirely different kind of justice. For a moment, Camille wondered if she could truly do it. If she could sit impartially on that bench after everything she'd endured. But then she recalled every injustice, every indignity, and every person who was counting on her to make a stand. This was not merely a coincidence, it was an opportunity, a chance to show what real justice looked like. In the days that followed, the courthouse buzzed with quiet murmurs as people filed in, finding their seats for an internal misconduct hearing. The case itself was not particularly high profile. A routine internal investigation into an incident of alleged excessive force involving 2 officers. To most, it was just another day in the justice system. At the defendant's table sat Officers Carter and Daniels, their uniforms pressed as if to serve as armor. They leaned toward one another, speaking in low, dismissive tones. To them, this was routine, a mere hurdle to clear. Then the door to the judge's chambers opened. In stepped Camille, her black judicial robe flowing gracefully behind her. She moved with a purpose that commanded respect, her expression calm yet undeniably authoritative as she took her seat. As she glanced toward the defendants, the transformation in the room was immediate. Officer Carter's face drained of color, his eyes widening in shock, while Daniel's shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening as he struggled to comprehend what he was witnessing. Here was the very woman they had so callously humiliated and arrested in the park, now presiding over their fate. After allowing a moment of heavy silence to settle over the courtroom, Camille began the proceedings in a clear, steady voice. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The officers sat rigidly, their composure visibly faltering. In a low, urgent whisper, Officer Carter exchanged a look with their lawyer, who simply nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on Camille. For the first time in weeks, Camille felt a subtle shift in the dynamic, yet she was quick to remind herself that this was not about personal revenge. As a judge, her duty was to remain impartial, and she would uphold that standard regardless of the irony. Throughout the opening arguments, Camille maintained her characteristic professionalism. She listened intently, taking detailed notes as the attorneys presented their cases. Every so often, however, her gaze would drift toward the officers. She noticed the tension in their shoulders, the nervous fidgeting of their hands during a recess. Later, during a brief break when Officers Carter and Daniel stepped into the hallway, their voices were low but agitated. "How is she the judge?" Carter hissed under his breath, barely containing his frustration. Daniel shook his head, murmuring, "This has to be a setup." Their lawyer interjected calmly, "It's a coincidence. You need to stay focused. She's not our enemy, your actions are." Yet the officers seemed too caught up in the surreal nature of their predicament to heed such counsel. When the court reconvened, Camille continued to preside over the hearing with unwavering composure. Every time she addressed the defendants, they shifted in their seats, their once cocky confidence gradually eroding. At one point during a witness's testimony, Camille caught Officer Carter stealing a furtive glance at her, a look that was less defiant than it was tinged with regret, as if he were beginning to understand the gravity of their actions. As the day wore on, it became increasingly evident that the evidence against the officers was overwhelming. The prosecutor's closing argument was a powerful call for accountability. "Your Honor," he declared, "the actions of these officers were not mere lapses in judgment but flagrant abuses of power. Their behavior reflects a systemic disregard for the very people they are sworn to protect." In response, the defense's closing statement faltered, their arguments growing increasingly desperate and unconvincing. Even the officers appeared resigned to the inevitable outcome. Finally, Camille adjourned the hearing with a resounding strike of her gavel. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., she announced. As the courtroom emptied, she lingered at her bench, meticulously organizing her notes. Outside, the officers hesitated by the door. Their steps heavy with the realization that this was far from over. The following morning, news of the unexpected twist had drawn an even larger crowd to the courtroom for the misconduct hearing. Although many were there out of curiosity, others had come specifically to support Camille, even though her role as judge prevented her from showing any overt favoritism. Camille entered the courtroom with her usual calm, composed demeanor, her robe flowing as she ascended to the bench. The attorneys wasted no time. The prosecutor methodically laid out a detailed case against the officers, presenting compelling evidence and moving testimony from the victim of the excessive force incident. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "the actions of these officers were not only a violation of protocol, they were an abuse of power that has caused immeasurable harm." Camille listened intently, her pen gliding swiftly across her notepad as she absorbed every detail. Even as the defense attorney rose to counter, his voice measured but strained, Camille's focus never wavered. "Your Honor," he argued, "while we acknowledge the incident, we contend that the situation escalated beyond the officers' control. Their intent was not malicious, and we believe that the case lacks sufficient grounds for punitive measures." As the debate continued, Camille could not help but notice the painful parallels between the excuses offered in this case and the justifications that had been used to validate her own arrest. Yet, she resolutely set aside her personal feelings and allowed the facts to guide her judgment. When it came time for cross-examination, the tension in the courtroom deepened palpably. The prosecutor called a young man named Ethan to the stand, a victim of an incident in which he had been forcefully tackled to the ground during a seemingly routine traffic stop. His voice trembled as he recounted the night's events. "They didn't even give me a chance to explain," Ethan said, his eyes darting nervously between the attorneys and the officers. "It was as if they had already decided I was guilty before I even spoke." The prosecutor pressed further. "Did you resist their orders at any point?" Ethan replied firmly, "No, I was frightened, but I did everything they told me." Despite the defense attorney's attempts to undermine his testimony, Ethan's resolve remained unbroken, much to the silent satisfaction of Camille, who observed every detail with an unreadable expression. Then came the moment the entire courtroom had been waiting for. The defendants were called to testify. Officer Carter was the first to take the stand. His eyes flickered nervously as he swore under oath, his voice trembling as he answered the prosecutor's probing questions. "Officer Carter," the prosecutor began, "you stand accused of using excessive force during the incident. Can you explain your actions that night?" Carter hesitated, his gaze shifting toward his partner, Daniels, before finally answering in a shaky voice. I thought the situation was escalating. I made a judgment call." The prosecutor pressed on. "And do you now believe your actions were justified?" Carter shifted in his seat. "At the time, yes," he murmured. "But looking back, I realized that I could have handled it differently." The prosecutor's follow-up was swift and unrelenting. "Handled it differently? How? By not tackling an unarmed, compliant individual to the ground?" Carter opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. His silence, heavy with regret, spoke volumes. When Officer Daniels took the stand, his demeanor was similarly strained. His attempts to justify his actions only served to reinforce the strength of the prosecutor's case, highlighting a troubling unwillingness to take responsibility. Camille listened intently, her face remaining impassive even as her inner emotions churned with a mixture of frustration and pity. These were men entrusted with authority they had wielded recklessly, leaving behind a trail of harm and shattered trust. As the day drew to a close, it became clear that the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecutor's closing argument was a stirring call for reform, a demand that the court set a precedent that abuse of power would not be tolerated. The defense, in contrast, grasped desperately at straws, their arguments lacking conviction and substance. Finally, Camille adjourned the hearing. "A ruling will be delivered next week," she declared, her voice steady as her gavel struck the sound block with decisive finality. As the courtroom emptied, Officers Carter and Daniels lingered near the exit, their faces pale and drawn. For the first time, they seemed to grasp the full weight of their actions and the harsh reality of what lay ahead. Yet Camille knew that true justice was not merely about punishment. It was about accountability, meaningful change, and ensuring that the mistakes of the past were not repeated. A week later, the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, pens at the ready, as every seat filled with people eager to witness the long-awaited ruling. This case had grown beyond a simple internal misconduct hearing. It had become a powerful symbol of the larger fight for justice and accountability. Camille entered the courtroom with a calm, resolute air. Taking her seat on the bench, she began her ruling. The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve the community with integrity, respect, and fairness. When those entrusted with this responsibility abuse their power, it erodes public trust and causes harm far beyond the immediate victim. This case has laid bare the consequences of such actions. Her gaze swept the room, pausing on Officers Carter and Daniels, who sat at the defense table with heads bowed. The evidence presented has demonstrated that Officers Carter and Daniels acted with unnecessary force, flagrantly disregarding the protocols they were sworn to uphold. Their actions were not only unjustified but also symptomatic of a troubling pattern that must be addressed. Accordingly, I hereby order the following consequences: mandatory suspension without pay, participation in an extensive retraining program, and the filing of a formal disciplinary record against both officers. When Camille finished, she brought down her gavel with a decisive strike. "This court is adjourned." For a long moment, the silence in the room was profound. As the officers prepared to leave, Carter hesitated and, with a voice barely audible, muttered, "Your Honor, I'm sorry. It wasn't enough to undo the harm, but perhaps it's a start?" Camille inclined her head slowly, acknowledging his words without offering any absolution. True change, she thought quietly, will come only through actions, not apologies. After the courtroom had emptied, Camille remained seated for several moments, gathering her thoughts. The victory, though a necessary step toward justice, felt bittersweet. For every case like this that was resolved, countless others remained unresolved, their voices still unheard. Later that evening, Camille attended a community meeting at a local recreation center. The room was filled with people, citizens, activists, and community leaders, all eager to share their stories, their frustrations, and their hopes for a more just future. As she listened intently, Camille felt a renewed sense of purpose stirring within her. After the meeting, an older woman approached, her voice trembling with emotion as she grasped Camille's hand tightly. "Thank you," the woman said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "What you did in that courtroom means the world to us." Camille offered a soft smile in response. "This is just the beginning," she replied quietly. "We have so much more work to do." In the weeks that followed, meaningful conversations blossomed among community leaders, law enforcement officials, and local activists. Camille used every available platform to advocate for reform, emphasizing the necessity for transparency, accountability, and fairness in policing practices. The case had sparked a ripple effect that extended far beyond Fort Collins. Across the state, people began demanding change, pushing for policies that prioritized equality and justice. For Camille, the journey was never about personal vindication. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure the injustice she had suffered. Every day, as she stood on the steps of the courthouse watching young activists gather for peaceful rallies, she felt a glimmer of hope. The system was far from perfect, but with enough voices united in the pursuit of progress, it could be steered toward meaningful change. That, she believed, was the kind of justice worth fighting for. As the months passed, Camille's case and her subsequent role as a judge became emblematic of the power of accountability and the necessity for reform. In every proceeding she presided over, in every community meeting and public forum, her voice remained a beacon of fairness and resilience. The very day when she was once unjustly arrested had set in motion a chain of events that now promised to reshape the way justice was delivered. Her experience, once a deeply personal wound, had transformed into a call to action for an entire community. Camille's determination, the support of the people, and the tangible changes she set in motion served as a powerful reminder that even in the face of systemic injustice, change was possible. And so, as she continued her work both in the courtroom and in the community, Camille remained steadfast, resolute in her belief that every act of accountability, every push for reform, was a step toward building a fairer, more just world. Today, as the sun sets over Fort Collins, casting long shadows across the quiet streets and parks, Camille's journey endures as a living testament to the transformative power of courage, determination, and hope. She knows that the road ahead will not be easy, and that the struggle for justice is never truly over. Yet, every day she finds solace in the knowledge that by standing up for what is right, by refusing to be silenced or diminished, she is helping to build a future in which every person is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. If you believe in the power of accountability and change, if you are inspired by the fight for justice that continues every day in our communities, then let this story remind you that we all have a part to play. Together, we can challenge the systems that allow injustice to persist. Together, we can demand transparency, fairness, and true equality. And together, we can build a world in which the dignity of every human being is honored, regardless of who they are or where they come from. In the end, Camille's journey is not just about one case, one arrest, or one courtroom ruling. It is about the collective strength of a community united in the pursuit of justice. It is about the courage to stand up even when the odds seem insurmountable, and about the unwavering belief that every act of resistance, every moment of dignity reclaimed, moves us closer to a better tomorrow. As we reflect on her story, let us all be reminded of the responsibility we share in creating a fairer society. Let us remember that true justice is built not only in the halls of the courthouse, but in every act of compassion, every effort to understand one another, and every determination to challenge the status quo. May this narrative inspire you to speak out against injustice, to hold those in power accountable, and to support the ongoing fight for civil rights and equality. For in our collective struggle, we find the strength to transform not only our legal system, but the very fabric of our society. Let us work together to create a future where fairness, respect, and true justice are not just ideals, but everyday realities for all.